Everything's gone. There's a fraud investigation tied to Gregory Hale.
What? Gregory? How?
We'll lose the house, the cars, every account. Within the month.
Daniel Whitfield had $400 million, a mansion on 11 acres, and a wife named Vanessa who he was almost certain no longer loved him. He sat in a rented Honda outside the gates of his own estate, wearing a jacket he bought at a thrift store for $6, and watched her walk past the window with a glass of wine in her hand, laughing at something on her phone. In 3 days, he was going to tell her that all of it was gone. The company, the accounts, the houses, all of it. And he needed to know, before he grew old and gave her the rest of his life, whether she had ever actually loved the man or only the money that came with him. This is not a story about a crime. Nobody was murdered, nobody was arrested, and there is no detective in this story. But by the end, you may find yourself more shaken than you would be by any of that. Because this is a story about the one thing every person in a relationship secretly wonders and almost never has the courage to actually test. Would the person lying next to you every night still choose you if you had nothing left to offer them? Daniel Whitfield built an entire operation just to find out. And what he discovered cost him more than his fortune ever could have. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel grew up in a 2-bedroom rental in Dayton, Ohio, the son of a machinist named Walter who worked double shifts and rarely made it home before his son was asleep. He started fixing lawnmowers at 12 years old for cash, and by 19 he had saved enough to buy a broken-down truck and start a small hauling business with a single employee, a friend named Marcus Boyd. Marcus would go on to become the only person Daniel trusted with anything that mattered for the rest of his life. And you should remember that name, because Marcus is going to matter a great deal before this story ends. The hauling business became a logistics company. The logistics company became a shipping and freight empire that stretched across 14 states by the time Daniel turned 40. He never forgot where he came from, and he never stopped being, at his core, a kid from Dayton who used to worry about the electric bill. He met Vanessa at a charity gala in Chicago 11 years ago. She was beautiful in the specific way that made rooms go quiet when she walked into them. And she had a laugh that made Daniel feel like the only man alive worth laughing for. She told him that night that she didn't care about his money, that she had grown up comfortable enough and wasn't impressed by wealth. And Daniel, who had spent his whole life being underestimated, believed every word of it. They married 18 months later in a ceremony that cost more than the house he grew up in. And for the first few years, Daniel would tell people that marrying Vanessa was the one decision in his life he never had to think twice about. But somewhere around year 6, small things started to bother him in a way he couldn't quite explain to anyone, including himself. Vanessa began correcting him in front of guests about which wine to order. She stopped introducing him as her husband and started introducing him as the owner of Whitfield Logistics. She spent more time with a circle of women whose husbands ran hedge funds and private equity firms than she did with Daniel's old friends from Dayton, most of whom she found, in her words, a little rough around the edges. None of this was proof of anything. People change, marriages evolve, and Daniel told himself repeatedly that he was being paranoid, that a man worth $400 million is always going to wonder if he is loved for the wrong reasons. But the thought never fully left him, and thoughts like that tend to grow quietly in the back of a person's mind until one day they demand an answer. The answer came, unexpectedly, from Marcus. Over dinner one night, after a few drinks, Marcus told Daniel about his own cousin, a modestly wealthy contractor in Ohio who had staged a fake bankruptcy to see how his fiancée would react, and who found out, in the ugliest way possible, that she was already planning her exit before he even finished explaining the situation. Daniel laughed about it that night. He did not laugh about it 3 weeks later, when he found himself lying awake at 4 in the morning, turning the same idea over in his head. If he was ever going to find out the truth about his marriage, it would have to be now, before children, before another decade passed, before the truth became too expensive to bear finding out. He called Marcus the next morning and told him what he wanted to do. Marcus tried to talk him out of it twice, warning him that some things, once known, cannot be unknown, and that Daniel needed to be prepared for the possibility that the answer would break something in him permanently. Daniel said he understood. He did not. Not really, not yet. Marcus eventually agreed to help, on one condition, that Daniel promised to end the experiment the moment it stopped being about the truth and started being about punishment. Daniel agreed. Neither of them fully kept that promise, but that comes later. The plan was built over the following 2 months with the help of a lawyer named Harold Griggs, an old friend of Daniel's who had handled quiet, sensitive matters for him before and knew how to keep a secret buried. They staged a sudden and dramatic collapse of Whitfield Logistics, tied to a fabricated federal investigation into a business partner who did not exist. Daniel moved a controlling portion of his actual assets into an untouchable trust that even his own attorney could not easily access without a lengthy legal process, ensuring that for a period of several months, on paper, Daniel Whitfield genuinely appeared to have nothing left. His real accounts were frozen from his own daily use. His cars were sold, quietly, to an associate who would return them later. And 3 days after that night, Daniel sat outside his own gates watching Vanessa laugh at her phone. He sat her down at their kitchen table and told her that everything was gone, that there had been a fraud investigation tied to a partner named Gregory Hale, and that within the month they would likely lose the house, the cars, and every account they shared. Vanessa's first reaction was silence, which Daniel expected. Her second reaction, roughly 90 seconds later, was to ask him a question he did not expect at all. She asked him how much of it, specifically, was actually gone, and how much he was simply worried about losing. It was a strange, almost clinical question to ask a man who had just told her his life's work had collapsed, and Daniel would think about that exact phrasing for weeks afterward, turning it over, trying to decide whether it meant she was already calculating her own next move, or whether she was simply in shock and grasping for facts to hold on to. He told her it was all gone, every account, every asset, and that within 30 days they would need to leave the house entirely. Vanessa did not cry. She asked for a moment alone and walked out to the garden, and Daniel watched her from the kitchen window, standing perfectly still among the roses for almost 20 minutes. Within a week, Daniel and Vanessa moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood called Milbrook that Vanessa had once referred to, at a dinner party, as the kind of place decent people simply drive around rather than through. The apartment had water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanged all night, and Daniel, who had not lived anywhere like it since he was a teenager in Dayton, found the sound almost comforting in a way he could not explain. He took a job under a false name at a freight yard nearby, loading trucks for $14 an hour, both to maintain the illusion and because he genuinely wanted to feel, physically, what it meant to start over with nothing. Vanessa did not take a job. She spent the first 2 weeks mostly in bed, and Daniel told himself this was grief, this was shock, this was a woman adjusting to a version of life she had never had to imagine before. Then the phone call started. Daniel noticed Vanessa stepping out onto the fire escape at odd hours, phone pressed to her ear, voice low, always ending the call the moment he came near. When he asked who she had been speaking to, she told him it was her sister, checking in, worried about her. Daniel wanted very badly to believe that. He had built an entire fabricated collapse around the idea of finding the truth, and now that the truth was arriving in small, uncomfortable pieces, some part of him was desperate to talk himself out of what he was seeing. This is the part of the story where I have to tell you something important, because it changes everything that comes after. Marcus Boyd, the friend from Dayton, the one man Daniel trusted completely, had been quietly keeping tabs on Vanessa the entire time, at Daniel's own request, through a private investigator named Roy Tillman. And 2 weeks into their new life in Milbrook, Roy sent Marcus a folder that Marcus did not want to be the one to hand over to his oldest friend. The folder contained photographs and phone records showing that Vanessa had, in fact, been in regular contact with a man named Preston Cole, a wealthy real estate developer she had known casually for years, someone Daniel had met exactly twice at industry events and never thought twice about. The records showed calls beginning the very same week Daniel announced the collapse of his business, not before, which mattered enormously, because it meant this was not a long-standing affair Daniel had simply failed to notice. It meant that the moment Vanessa believed her husband had nothing left, she had begun quietly building an exit towards someone who did. Marcus sat on that folder for 4 days before he could bring himself to show Daniel. And when he finally did, in the front seat of that same rented Honda parked outside the Milbrook apartment, Daniel did not yell, and he did not cry. He simply asked Marcus to read the dates out loud to him twice, as if hearing them a second time might change what they said. For the next 10 days, Daniel said nothing to Vanessa. He went to the freight yard every morning, came home every night, and watched his wife with a kind of calm attentiveness that unsettled even him. He wanted to see how far it would go before she either confessed or the truth simply revealed itself. And it was during those 10 days that something happened which Daniel had not accounted for at all when he designed this entire experiment. A neighbor from 2 doors down, an older woman named Loretta who cleaned offices downtown for a living, began leaving containers of food outside their door twice a week, insisting it was too much for her alone and it would go to waste otherwise. A younger man named Curtis, who Daniel worked alongside at the freight yard, spent an entire unpaid Saturday helping Daniel fix an old radiator in the apartment, refusing any money for it, telling Daniel that was simply what people in Milbrook did for each other. Daniel Whitfield, a man worth $400 million who had spent 11 years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, found himself surrounded, for the first time in decades, by people who wanted nothing from him at all, and it broke something open in him that the fake collapse of his business never touched. On the 11th day, Vanessa told Daniel she needed to visit her sister in Cleveland for the weekend. Marcus had already confirmed, through Roy Tillman, that there was no sister in Cleveland that weekend, only a reservation under Preston Cole's assistant's name at a hotel 2 hours north. Daniel let her go. He told her to have a safe trip and kissed her on the cheek at the door, and the moment her car turned the corner, he sat down at the kitchen table in that small apartment above the laundromat, and, for the first time since this entire plan began, he allowed himself to actually feel what was happening to him, rather than simply observing it from a careful distance. He did not sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus came over with 2 coffees and sat with him without saying much of anything, because there was nothing left to say that either of them didn't already understand. Vanessa returned on Sunday evening with a story about her sister's new apartment and a headache from the drive, and Daniel listened to the entire fabrication without correcting a single detail, because he had decided, sometime around 4 that morning, exactly how this was going to end. He told her he had good news, that Harold Griggs had called that afternoon, that the federal investigation into Gregory Hale had cleared Daniel of any wrongdoing, and that the frozen assets, the house, the cars, everything, all of it, would be restored within days. He watched Vanessa's face carefully as he said it, and for just a moment, before she composed herself into relief, he saw something flicker across her expression that looked less like joy and more like a woman recalculating a plan she had already begun executing. 3 weeks later, the entire truth came out at once, deliberately, on an evening Daniel had planned down to the hour, in the very same kitchen where he had first told her everything was gone. Harold Griggs sat at the table. Marcus stood by the door. Daniel laid out the folder from Roy Tillman, the phone records, the hotel reservation, the timeline that started the same week as the fake collapse, and told Vanessa the truth, that none of it had ever actually been real, that Whitfield Logistics had never lost a single account, that the entire collapse had been constructed for one purpose only, to see who she would run toward the moment she believed he had nothing left to offer her. Vanessa did not deny the affair. She sat very still for a long time, and then she told Daniel something he had genuinely not expected to hear, that she had known, almost from the beginning, that something about the collapse felt staged, that the timeline never quite added up to her, and that her relationship with Preston had started not out of greed exactly, but out of a need to feel, for once in her marriage, like she was choosing someone rather than being chosen, since every part of their life together for 11 years had revolved entirely around Daniel's world, his money, his friends, his name attached to hers wherever they went. That confession did not excuse what she had done, and Daniel never pretended that it did, but it complicated the story in a way he had not prepared for. He had built this entire experiment expecting a clean answer, a simple villain, proof one way or the other, and what he got instead was something messy and far more human, a marriage where both people had, in their own ways, stopped truly seeing each other years before either of them admitted it out loud. Daniel filed for divorce 4 months later. Vanessa did not fight it, and did not ask for a settlement beyond what the prenuptial agreement already guaranteed her, which surprised the small circle of people who knew the full story. Preston Cole, for what it's worth, ended his own engagement roughly 6 weeks after the truth came out, though nobody involved would say publicly whether that was connected. Daniel Whitfield still owns the mansion on 11 acres, though he rarely stays there anymore. He kept the apartment above the laundromat in Milbrook, quietly, under a different name, and visits it most weekends. Loretta still leaves food outside a door on that floor, though the tenant now is not who she thinks it is. Curtis still works at the freight yard, and still has no idea that the quiet, reliable coworker he spent a Saturday fixing a radiator with was worth more money than everyone in that neighborhood combined. Marcus Boyd remains the one person Daniel trusts completely, and the one person who knows the entire story from beginning to end. Daniel says now, when he allows himself to talk about it at all, that he went looking for the truth about his marriage and found something else entirely, the truth about which version of his own life had actually made him feel like a person worth knowing. And it was not the one with 11 acres and $400 million attached to it. Some people who hear this story ask whether Daniel regrets what he did, whether staging an entire collapse of his life to test the person he loved was cruel, manipulative, or simply the honest reckoning of a man who had spent too many years wondering. There is no clean answer to that question, and maybe that's the entire point of a story like this one. Would the people closest to you still choose you if you had nothing left to offer them? Daniel Whitfield needed to know badly enough that he was willing to burn his own life down to find out. And even now, having lived through every part of it, he isn't entirely sure the answer he got was worth what it cost him to ask the question in the first place.